Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your attendance here this morning. How are standards and open source similar and different? Why do standards want to collaborate with open source? And how should they collaborate with open source? What can open source learn from standards organizations? And finally, what does this mean to you in the audience today? Today I'm going to shed some light on industry trends on around how open source and standards organizations are learning to collaborate and taking on the best parts of each process to advance the entire technology industry and the state of the art. My name is Craig Northway, and I've worked in the open source office at Qualcomm for around 9 years. I also represented Canon on the W3C SVG working group in a previous role. I've been involved in both standards and open source for over 15 years. Qualcomm has a rich history in standards organizations, and more recently as a strong developer, contributor, and participant in open source projects supporting the mobile and connectivity ecosystems. So we're uniquely qualified to lead industry change around how we participate cohesively in standards and open source. Firstly, a little bit of background on Qualcomm. Qualcomm's a company based in San Diego, in California, and our inventions are foundational technologies that others build upon. We help to invent new industries and applications that have global impact. We're the brain behind your smartphone, and we're leading the industry to 5G. You'll find our products not just in cell phones, but in the automotive sector, in the data center, in home Wi-Fi products, IoT, personal computing, and security. We participate in a broad range of standards bodies and industry organizations, over 400, and we have 2,000 employees that participate in those organizations in some manner, either directly or through their development activities. We also have over 2,000 employees who interact closely with open source. That ranges from enablement projects that help us to sell chipsets, things like business assistant projects that help us run the infrastructure that we need to do our development and build the hardware that we build, as well as personal interest projects that our engineers participate on. We've vetted over 2,500 projects for our use, modification, or for upstream contribution. So let's start with the first question that I spoke about. How are open source and standards similar and different? They're both ways companies collaborate to share the cost of development, but for slightly different business models. So a lot of the same words apply to both an open source collaboration method or a standards collaboration method. If you brainstorm and think about the type of words you use, things like interoperable, community, licenses, organizations, foundations, contributions, very similar vernacular, very similar ways in which you interact. But there are a couple of differences. So this quote from Rob Landley, a kernel developer, I think helps me to sort of sum up what open source software means. It's commodity software. It's a level playing field in which anyone can participate. Typically, when open source software is an efficiency where companies or organizations share one implementation or a significant shared code. So in the open source model, often companies compete around the implementation instead of with their implementations. And there's a bunch of different businesses that fit in this model. Hardware vendors who share Linux kernels, distribution vendors, again, sharing things like the Linux kernel, service and subscription models where people have platform as a service built on open source, but they're not competing with the open source software itself. This is a quote about standards from a book on open source, interestingly. And it sort of sums up one of the key differences between open source and standards. While both of them help to sort of commoditize and make technology available, in a standards-driven ecosystem, you typically compete on the implementation. You don't you don't build a standard for something that you can easily implement today or that's already implemented today. The areas in which we invest in standards often require some long-term R&D investment, things like new wireless standards. So open source and standards are different but complementary models. So why do standards organizations, abbreviated here as SDOs, want to collaborate with open source projects and using open source methods? Standards organizations are seen as slow-moving by the industry. They're seen as slow to take on implementation feedback, A lot of standards organizations came from sort of a hardware development background, and the pace seems slow, but they are deliberate and thorough in their development process. Whereas open source is perceived by the industry as fast and agile. There's often a high bar to participate in standards. It does vary between standards organizations. Some are very difficult to participate in. For instance, ISO sort of standards body where you have to have basically the government decides who is participating versus things like the IETF where people can just sort of turn up to a standards meeting. And I have an example of how it sort of can be difficult to interact and collaborate with standards. So this is a screenshot from GitHub. So GitHub is sort of the standard, well, I shouldn't use the word standard again, but sort of the standard way in which we interact in the open source community. When you see a GitHub page, everyone knows how to interact with that project. You know how to raise an issue, you know how to submit a pull request, you know how to engage with that project. And you can see anyone can see real time what's happening in the project. And there's sort of this consistent workflow used throughout open source projects, even those not hosted on GitHub, but things hosted on other services like GitLab or things, projects that might be running a Gerrit instance or something like that. There's still this consistent workflow of requests to take patches and the review of those patches and so forth, so on. Whereas standards organizations all have a different interface. So not to pick on IEEE, but if you come to this IEEE, I think this is I can't remember if this is a Bluetooth or Wi-Fi standard. I can't quite read right now. I think it's related to Wi-Fi. You don't immediately know how to interact with this organization. It's not always obvious how to join and participate, and there's no consistent model across the organizations. When I did go to this page, I tried to work out how a random person would know how to interact with the IEEE, and I eventually navigated my way down to a form where you could submit requests for membership, but every standards organization has its own set of rules and policies and processes around this, so it's very complicated. It's a high bar to join and participate. So now we've talked about some of the reasons why standards organizations want to collaborate using open source and collaborate like open source projects. Now I want to talk a little bit about how I think they should collaborate in that manner. So one of the problems that I pointed out earlier was that standards have traditionally been slow about implementation experience being rolled back into the standard. Software moves too fast for this, open source software in particular. We need to get the best of both worlds and enable fast-paced feedback and iterative development of standards. Standards needs to learn from open source on working with a broad community and getting that feedback. We think that producing some open source work product will allow feedback into the standards process and improve the architecture and improve the speed of the development process. Standards organizations don't necessarily need to create full implementations or reference implementations, but they need to learn about open source collaboration methods to be able to do software and make standards development quicker. Some standards organizations are already starting to use the tools available to the open source software community. So we have standards organizations who are using GitHub for issue tracking, document editing internally, and publicizing sometimes. I have two examples here. We have OMA, the Open Mobile Alliance, that have a lot of public content on this particular site, but there's a large private organization. They have open source licensing models compatible with their traditional IPR policies, and they're also looking at how to enable collaboration where a royalty-free model is appropriate or required. We also have IETF as an example. They do a lot of collaboration more publicly, directly on their specifications. You can go and see them editing some of these specifications in public. Embracing these open source ways of working or collaborating, both these organizations are embracing open source ways of working or collaborating in different manners to accelerate their standards development. IETF is also running hackathons. It's a very familiar concept to the open source community. And if you look at the goal here, it repeats some of the things that I've been saying throughout this presentation. Their goal is to advance the pace and relevance of the standards activities by bringing the speed and collaborative spirit of open source development into the IETF. So now let's turn you flip the coin here. Can open source improve collaboration with lessons from standards development processes? I think the answer is yes, and I think it's already happening. About a year ago, the CNCF released a serverless white paper. The CNCF, I think everyone here should know what the CNCF is. When I gave this presentation about a year ago, I had to spell that out more clearly. This is an open source project, part of the Linux Foundation. But they're also building a standard. This serverless white paper is effectively a serverless computing event format and API. Now, why are they doing this? Mostly to avoid vendor lock-in. Even in the cloud technology space, which is dominated by open source projects, open source software, they still have a potential problem of vendor lock-in. If services are not easily interchangeable, there's a real possibility of this occurring. So how many times have you written glue code to stick together various pieces of open source code? Have you ever tried to replace one JavaScript library you're using with another? Standard interfaces are important even in the open source community. I actually picked Lego as an analogy of something I thought was a good standard interface, but then I thought about it a bit more, and it turns out it's really a proprietary vendor lock-in with Lego. So I was looking around for a better example of how standards enable us to maintain interoperability and backwards compatibility. And so I came back to the telephone or communication systems, where we have a great story of interoperability over many, many years. We have a broad ecosystem participating in governance and a coordinated approach. And your old rotary dial telephone, if you have the right, you might have to call up your service provider and get them to re-enable the POT standard on your particular line. But chances are you can probably get your rotary dial telephone to still call the cell phone that your friend has that was released yesterday. This industry and this interoperability and backwards compatibility is relying on standards. If you compare that to the interoperability we see in open source sometimes, even between projects that work in the same ecosystem or even different versions of a fast-moving open source project, you'll see that the standards have some value in enabling this long-term interoperability and backwards compatibility. An article from someone I know from the open source community, from Kevin Bloomberg, about a year ago on opensource.com, had a story of how they tried to roll out OpenStack at Bloomberg. And this article showed that early in the life cycle of open source projects, the governance, long-term roadmaps, long-term support, and backwards compatibility are not always front and center of the development team's mind. Kevin mentioned numerous standards like construction in this article that are being implemented in open source communities through forums such as the Linux Foundation that provide long-term guidance from end users, not just the developers active in the project. In his article, he explained how by the time an enterprise can integrate, test, and roll out a project, potentially you're out of date and left behind by the latest version of the project. I was discussing this with some standards colleagues, and I made an analogy of these open source projects that are fast moving, that don't care about users, to like a train that was going very fast. My standards colleagues suggested that if an open source project was a train, it wouldn't actually stop at any of the stations because it doesn't always care about those end users. Another potential issue in open source projects that standards like governance structures can help avoid is fragmentation. Fragmentation results when multiple projects each deliver part of an overall solution but can't be used together, frustrating any progress and interfering with high-level innovation. Steering the roadmap of a set of related projects by a broad stakeholder group, not just having each project driven by a couple of key maintainers or committers in isolation, helps to solve this problem. So I think we've seen open source foundations take on this role of providing this higher level guidance through technical steering committees and the like to avoid fragmentation. So I think this is an example of the open source community learning and evolving based on standards practices. Another thing that standards organizations have had for a long time is clear contributing and participation rules, clear rules for membership and how you should participate, They have good processes around disagreement and coming to conclusion with consensus, which helps to get diverse participation from all members. For instance, IEEE had an ethics committee since the 1970s. In open source, we've only really started to focus on this sort of behavioral concerns and interactions between the people in the last few years. I think we're doing a great job at moving forward in spreading codes of conduct and things like the contributor covenant, but standards organizations have been doing this for some time. But what about IP policy? So one concern that people might have with standards and open source interacting is how does the IP policy work? As we know from standards over the years, some projects thrive under royalty-free frameworks, whereas some projects thrive under FRAND frameworks, that's fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory frameworks. So typically, when you have something that is closer to the near term, that can be more immediately realized in product development, these sort of projects tend to fare well under royalty-free frameworks. Things that involve a larger investment in R&D, higher risk, advancing the state of the art and the science that might fail, tend to thrive better under FRAND terms. There's not necessarily a universal key for both worlds. Our royalty-free is not necessarily going to work in all situations. So one problem with standards one problem with open source projects under royalty-free terms and using them as standards is that these royalty-free open source licenses may not always make clear what standards are essential. They might only apply royalty-free terms to a specific implementation, and they may not grant rights to all contributions from everyone. I don't think you can have a standards and open source collaboration purely under a royalty-free open source license. You probably need an IP policy or agreement for the standard as well that clearly stipulates the terms for any implementations and all of the essential IP. Many existing standards development organizations have FRAND or disclosure-only IP policies, and these have worked very well in some situations. If we consider two aspects of licensing, copyright and patents, if we can enable these organizations to work with an open source based copyright license and a FRAND patent policy by making the source code license copyright only and potentially adding an explicit pointer to the SDO IP policy to cover patent commitments, we think we can make open source and standards work together even in FRAND SDOs. So I've talked about why standards organizations want to participate in open source, what standards organizations can learn from the open source community, and what the open source community can potentially learn from standards organizations. Now, what can we do? What can the people in this room, the people from the open source community, the people from open source program offices, or the people from industry standards activities do to make this a reality? I think the first thing we can do is educate each other. I think it's important to have your open source program office and your industry standards program office in a coordinated approach. So, if you have an industry standards office or you're working with an SDO or part of an SDO, there's a couple things I think that you need to learn about open source that you can learn from open source program offices. The first one is open source compliance and the effect of non-compliance. In standards organization structures with these membership policies and IP policies, it's going to be very important to ensure compliance all around. Another important thing that the participants in industry standards and the standards organizations need to learn about is open source development practices. They need to learn about how the open source community does CI and testing. They need to learn about how the open source community ensures parity with the broad community and tool availability for everyone. And they need to know about how open source offices and open source projects deal with security vulnerabilities. They also need to learn about open source community best practices, things like how the community does issues and bug tracking, how we do documentations, the importance of chat in the community, what a fair and efficient review and response process is for an open source project, and they need to learn about monitoring and metrics for project health. These are all things that open source program officers teach their companies about day to day. So I think open source program officers are key to educating both the people within your company who are involved in industry standards and the standards development organizations themselves. So I think that the open source program officers in open source can also learn from industry standards officers and standards organizations. In particular, things like expectation of complete release and high quality standards. Software developers often typically just go chasing the next exciting project rather than going back to update documentation to match implementation changes. Standards processes tend to work around more formalized release and review processes. They tend to produce high quality work products prior to public release after a private or semi-private collaboration, and they generally include good documentation. Some open source projects could stand to benefit from the increased rigor in releases of their code and documentation. Open source projects need to learn about governance and antitrust compliance if they're going to be involved in standards organizations. Good and impartial governance helps avoid the creation of overlapping, non-diverse and confusing projects. And open source projects, as I said before, that don't connect to form larger architectures can also create fragmentation. Good governance creates a community that considers both the upstream and downstream connectivity of the project. Standards tend to do this well. They have a broad set of members and contributors from related industries and are generally not dominated by one interest or participant. They have process around disagreement and coming to conclusions with consensus. They also tend to have strong antitrust laws, helping participants to abide by competition law. The other thing that I mentioned is interoperability and backwards compatibility. This is a key thing that I think open source can learn from standards if they to collaborate together further. Similarly, I mentioned long-term strategy, roadmaps, and planning. And finally, the other key point that I think open source can learn from industry standards officers is these clear rules for contributing, participation, and IP declaration. So, what are we doing at Qualcomm to ensure internal collaboration between our open source office and our industry standards office? We collaborate on training and awareness for our engineering. So we have compulsory open source training for all of our engineers. So we've collaborated with the standards organization to include some additional material into our open source training. Because like with open source, the most effective way to avoid issues is generally proactive education and awareness. So our messaging is evolving, that our training will also include guidance about these sort of dual process engagements where a project might be both open source, both an open source project and a specification. So we also collaborate on compliance. We leverage our open source compliance process and the sort of escalations we have around that, our contribution process. We leverage that to also ensure that we capture information about standards implementations or standards participation. And we also collaborate a lot on outreach. So we have events like our Qualcomm Open Source Summit, where we invite open source influential people in the open source community to come and present to the company. So we collaborate on covering a broad range of topics there that flows into standards, and also inviting the standards team to such events. We've aligned our review processes, and we agree on clear handoff points between the different parties. So a quote from one of my colleagues, in his way of knowing when it's open source and when it's a standards organization, he said that standards organizations ask you to join and open source projects ask you to contribute. So we have a nice clear delineation in our process when we hand off from, say, an open source review into a standards review or vice versa, depending on the questions that we ask as part of the review. We also regularly host strategy meetings between key members of our standards industry group and our open source team. We discuss open source in various industry bodies, and we track the status and progress of those groups towards a workable model. We're lucky to have several people with experience in both open source and standards who help us to align on this combined approach. I think standards and open source will continue to blend further over time. We'll start to see more hybrid organizations or coordinated organizations then mix the structures of open source and standards. We'll see more standards-like constructs in open source projects to provide better governance and improve collaboration from all parties. We'll see standards development start to utilize the methods for collaboration used by the open source community, such as Github. While this is happening though, we want to preserve the value of standards, ensure a means to competing implementations, and incentives for long-term R&D investment as standards adopt practices from open source and develop open source to ensure fast-paced implementation feedback. I think that everyone in the industry needs to consider a coordinated approach to both their standards and open source activities. Thank you. Any questions? I'm happy to take questions or chat here or in the hall afterwards. Sure.
I'd like to ask about the review process in the company. Do you have any best practice for the review process? Because if we create this strict process to contribute to open source project, it takes a long time to contribute.
Yeah.
So, but I'd like to reduce this cost. So if you have any example, I'd like to know.
Yeah, so in some cases it's very challenging to reduce that time. So I don't think you can reduce that time for every case. So if you have to, or your lawyers want to do something like a patent search for a particular contribution, then that might take a long time. The most success we've had is by having sort of exceptions to the long process. So working out what you can easily approve quickly. So the easiest one is like bug fixes, test code, documentation. You can have a fairly abbreviated process for those sort of contributions because they're typically not of concern to your legal, not as much concern to your legal department. So we have a documented policy around those particular exemptions. So if you fall into that category, it's very quick. And then like classifying up front which areas are of IP concern. So you sort of know which technologies you need more review in advance. And that way you can quickly give a faster review to a project if it doesn't fall into those IP areas. And we actually have a couple of different grades of process, right? So there's basically three. So the lowest tier, where you can get a very first is the bug fixes, test code, documentation. Then there's the lowest tier of IP concern, which is very quick and doesn't require escalation to like a review board. And then the next two levels require escalation up to a review board and potentially things like patent searches and lots of lawyers. So our approach to make things quick is if you can sandbox them into the safe areas, then you can make those safe areas very quick.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question. You mentioned about how the SDOs can learn from the open source and how the open source can learn from the SDOs. And finally, you said that in the future they can blend together. I want to know how can they blend more than learn from each other?
Can they blend?
Yeah, in which way?
I'm not sure that they. I think what we'll see is and we already see this. We see standards organizations who produce open source code that accompanies their standard process, and then we see open source organizations that produce standards associated with those open source projects. And it's probably, maybe there's a blend between the two, and maybe we'll see some organizations that do both. But at the moment, I think you have organizations like the Linux Foundation. There's this new Joint Development Foundation that's recently come under the Linux Foundation, and that's a way to standardize based on an open source project. And so I think in the short term, that's how open source foundations will move into the standardization process by standardizing around their open source projects. Whereas on the SDO side, I think we'll just see SDOs that produce open source code that accompanies their standard implementation. I don't think we've seen an organization that does both standards first and open source first yet. Any other questions? I'm happy to chat afterwards to anyone who's interested. Thank you.